Geert Vanden Bossche. You probably have heard this name. He became instantaneously famous in March of this year when he published an open letter where he expressed his concerns about the mass vaccination program against COVID-19 that was underway in full swing at that time. Who is he? What are his ideas, and what can we make of them is what I want to discuss today. I'm Dr. Gily. As usual on this channel, I try to help you make sense of health information and claims related to health, and during this pandemic, claims related to the COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccination program associated with it. So let's dive right into it. Dr. Van Bossche, he is a virologist. He apparently has a PhD in virology, and he was a project manager at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He has been able to come up with some fairly well-crafted ideas that scare people away from vaccination. And I want to present to you today 5 reasons why I disagree with his main claims. His main claim is that immunizing in the middle of a pandemic, a large segment of the population, is going to exert evolutionary pressure, just like improperly administered antibiotics lead to antibiotic resistance in bacteria. In a similar way, this vaccination pressure will ultimately result in resistant and more infectious variants of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Allow me to go through 5 reasons why he is blatantly wrong. Number 1, he states that vaccines should not be used during a pandemic. His idea is that if you have a vaccine that's not perfect, and certainly this vaccine is not 100% effective, especially on the long term, if you are in the middle of a pandemic, you are going to get into more trouble than you are going to get help from vaccination. And in fact, he goes as far as to claim in some of his presentations that it is a fundamental principle of vaccinology that you do not vaccinate in the middle of a pandemic. It's been a while since I've been through medical school, so I went back to the literature to see if indeed this has become a principle that I was not aware of, that you don't vaccinate in the middle of a pandemic. And what I found is actually quite the contrary, and that is, historically even speaking, let alone the COVID-19 pandemic, whenever we had an epidemic, for example, in the old days when we had the variola outbreaks in various parts of the world, or even larger epidemics of that, the best strategy to contain that was vaccination. And it's actually one of the fundamental principles in vaccinology is the so-called ring vaccination, which is the opposite of what he's saying. And that is, when you have an outbreak, what you do, you vaccinate the contacts of the sick people, and then you vaccinate the contacts of those people. And you go in concentric circles like that to isolate the outbreak. And this is how variola was contained, and it was brought to extinction eventually. This first statement that you don't vaccinate in the pandemic, it's clearly and blatantly wrong. Second one, he makes this comparison between vaccination pressure on the virus and antibiotic resistance for bacteria. And his claim is that the more we vaccinate, the more we increase the risk of selecting resistant strains of virus. And I want you to understand one thing about antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Bacteria are living organisms. They are, even though they are one-cell organisms, they are quite complex. They have a metabolism. They can reproduce on their own. They communicate with each other. And in fact, in this picture, if you look, there is 2 bacterial cells on the top portion there, one next to each other. And one of them has inside something called a plasmid, which is a component that has inside of it, that red portion of it, is a gene that codes resistance to a certain antibiotic. And this bacterial cell on the left, as you look to the upper portion of the screen, communicates to the one on the right. It gives it that plasmid, and thus it allows for this horizontal gene transfer of antibiotic resistance. That same phenomenon can occur even without the cells coming together through what we call phages or bacteriophages, where particles that are virus-like really uptake that gene that codes for bacterial resistance, take it from the resistant bacteria and transmit it to another bacterial cell that is not yet resistant, and that in turn becomes resistant to that antibiotic. So when we talk about antibiotic resistance in bacteria, we're talking mainly about horizontal gene transfers one way or another between cells that then in turn allow for that bacterial cell to become more resistant to a certain antibiotic. When we talked about viruses, and I'll explain a bit more detail later on, but suffice it to say at this point that viruses do not exchange genetic material like bacteria in this fashion. They cannot communicate to each other resistance to the vaccine or anything else for that matter. So while the analogy is interesting and it could be considered a nice figure of style or a metaphor, if it doesn't have base in reality, it is really useless. You want to use metaphors, but you want them to correspond to reality and to facts. Otherwise, they are just, stories or fiction. Number 2, or 3 rather, he claims that immunization leads to weakening of the natural immunity. This is one of the main points of his argumentation. He says by vaccination, we inadvertently end up weakening our natural immunity, and in doing so, we become more vulnerable and easier victims to these new strains of virus that are going to occur. Is that the case? When you develop acquired immunity through infection or through vaccination, that acquired immunity works hand in hand with the natural immunity. They don't fight with each other. They are not there to compete with each other or to outcompete each other. They work in sync. They are designed to do so. You know, the innate immunity is more important early on before we can make antibodies to stave the progression of the infection. And then the specific antibody-based and immune cell-based specific immunity comes later and eliminates the virus. But they are not there to fight and outcompete each other. And there is no evidence in the literature that shows that that is the case. The number 4 reason, which is very much related to the one I just mentioned, is his claim that we have certain types of antibodies, natural antibodies, that are not virus-specific. They are IgM antibodies, and those IgM antibodies clustered together, 5 of them in a pentamer. They link together in 5 together, and they form this big molecule, and they block those viruses. Whereas the vaccine-generated virus-specific antibodies are monomers. They are just one molecule at a time, and they bind on the specific sites on the virus. So his idea is that these IgGs outcompete the natural IgMs and make those weaker. What he's not saying is something that's been known even since I was in medical school some decades ago, and that is IgM antibodies, those bigger pentamers, they have a very poor capacity to extravasate, to come out of the vascular system, whether it's blood or lymphatic system, and go into tissues because they are so big. Whereas the IgGs, the acquired antibodies after vaccination or infection for that matter, are much smaller molecules, and their ability to extravasate and go into the respiratory tract, into the salivary glands, into the lungs, is much orders of magnitude better than this innate IgM. Those may be better in terms of their non-specificity to certain strains of the virus. Their ability to do their work where it's needed at the port of entry of the virus is almost non-existent. So I don't know what he's talking about, but there's no basis in reality about this outcompeting of IgMs by IgGs and that kind of stuff. It just doesn't happen that way. The number 5 reason, and the most important in my opinion, is that he starts from a neo-Darwinian evolutionary point of view when he develops this whole theory about viral resistance. What he says is that at some point, very likely in the near future, now just a parenthesis here, he was writing this in March. We're in November now, so this near future should have happened by now, I think, and it hasn't. So that alone should tell you something. But anyways, he says that in the near future, very near future, it's going to become more profitable for the virus, in terms of return on selection investment. So wait a minute. He's talking about the virus as if it is some sort of intelligent entity that it's able to make determinations of what's the return on investment when it comes to how much it spends on developing these mutations. The virus is in a position to plan ahead almost and decide which mutations to do where and when. You know, maybe just one or two, you know, because the virus is so smart, he's not going to waste too much resources except doing the mutations that are the most advantageous. That's the idea he's talking about here. You know, those mutations that are the best in the S protein, and there you go, you get these viral variants in an attempt to further strengthen its binding to the receptor, to ACE2 receptor, expressed on the surface of permissive epithelial cells. So he starts, as I said, from a purely neo-Darwinian evolutionary paradigm here, trying to scare us essentially by saying that, you know, this virus is smart. It's an organism that's going to outsmart our vaccine. Essentially, that's what he's saying. And therefore, we shouldn't mess up with it. In reality, and I want you to think about this for a moment, and I made a video about the evolution of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and what that has led to so far. That was a few months ago, but the reality hasn't changed since then. Think about the variants we have in circulation now, from the ancestral variant Delta. When did these variants emerge? They emerged at a time where we had no vaccination for most of the early ones, or in the case of Delta in India, I believe less than 5% of the population was vaccinated. Furthermore, think about of any country or region that has achieved an 80+% vaccination rate, where the vaccination pressure should have been the highest. Are you aware of any variant, resistant variant, that has emerged from such a population? I'm sure you can't come up with any. So what the reality is saying is exactly the opposite of what he claims, and that is most variants have originated in populations that were not vaccinated, that were not protected, that the virus had free reign as far as the spread. And if we keep in mind that in one infected person, you can have 10 to the power of 12 viral particles, 10 to the power of 12. Think about that number. Viral particles that every 10 hours or so multiply in a new generation. And that multiplication of the virus in the host cell is not perfect. We are lucky that the coronavirus has a proofreading protein incorporated in it that decreases the rate of errors, of mistakes in copying the genetic information. But even then, it's not perfect. Mistakes do occur, even if it's 1 in a million. If you have, when you are sick, at the moment where you're the sickest, 10 to the power of 12 viral particles in your body, you are bound to experience in your own body a few mutations of that virus as you go through the disease. And if you're talking about hundreds of millions of people who have been sick in the world so far, you can see where this virus has had the opportunity to go randomly through these mistakes that are not planned. The virus doesn't think ahead and decide which one to have. They just happen by random chance when the viral genetic material is copied again. The virus has had ample opportunity to have a vast array of mutations in all kinds of places in all of its proteins so far already. Most mutations in viruses and other organisms are neutral to mildly deleterious, meaning that they either have no effect on the virus fitness or they have such a small negative effect that it's almost imperceptible. A small number are very deleterious and that virus dies. It goes extinct, that mutated strain. The vast majority is neutral acid, and very rarely, maybe 1 in a million or 1 in a billion mutations convey a certain advantage to the virus, and that virus spreads easier, like in the case of the Delta variant, for example, and takes over the other variants because it has that infectious advantage to it. But this advantage is the result of a burden of mutation that's much, much bigger in terms of neutral deleterious or mildly deleterious mutations, which in turn, over the long term, will lead to the weakening of the virus. This is what happened with the influenza virus and most other viruses that we know so far. There is a gradual, slow over time, but consistent decrease in fitness of these viruses. And some of them even go extinct after a certain number of years, precisely because of this mechanism of genetic entropy that happens consistently in all organisms. That's why we age, among other things, right? And that's why all organisms eventually die, you know. But anyways, I thought it would be very important to make it clear that, again, the scenario where you see SARS-CoV-2 variants emerging is when we don't have vaccination, where we have a large group of people getting infected at the same time or in a short period of time, and when the virus can multiply in an infected organism for weeks on end, as opposed to a vaccinated individual who may get a reinfection and be sick for 3-4 days with a mild case of COVID, and with a much, much less opportunity for the virus to undergo mutations and to generate resistant strains during that time. So my prediction is that as we move forward, that instead of seeing a plethora of new variants because of vaccination, we're actually going to see less, to the extent that we manage to vaccinate more people. Of course, if large groups of population remain unvaccinated and the virus continues to spread like fire, the chance of new variants will still be present. Or partially vaccinated, where half of the country is non-vaccinated, you still have a huge reservoir where that virus can still multiply, right? But anyways, that's kind of the fifth reason why I disagree with Dr. Van Bossche, and that is, I am not sitting on an evolutionary foundation fearing that natural selection and the competition between the innate and the acquired immunity will be detrimental to us, or that vaccination will force the virus to devise some new mutation and infect us and things like that. What is Dr. Van Bosche's solution to all of this? How does he see us coming out of this predicament? And you may think that he comes up with some other ideas, but what he's proposing really here is, you may be surprised, vaccination. He's suggesting we get vaccinated as well, but not with the regular vaccine that's out in the world now. He's proposing a natural killer vaccine that he has written some articles in the past about, and he presumably is involved in devising, but there's nothing out there right now.